Next, I'd like to invite Professor Rebecca Eisenberg. She's a professor at Michigan Law University. With her, we hope to explore a little bit the rights, the exclusive patent rights. And with her, we are going to land in Africa and afterwards in the border between the United States and Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have too much to say for my allotted time. This is a very common problem of mine. Usually the way I handle that is by speaking very fast. But with an international audience, I think maybe that strategy is not going to work so well. So I'm not sure. I'll need frequent reminders of how the time is going here. I come to this topic as an intellectual property scholar from a different perspective, I think, than many people who have been following it closely and have been actively engaged in trying to resolve it from a human rights perspective or from an international trade perspective. Sometimes it's interesting, if not helpful, to get an outsider's approach to a vexing problem, so I don't let that stop me. I've been studying patents in biomedical research for years now, and that's a focus that has usually allowed me to feel pretty good about the patent system. I am very focused on innovation and bringing about new technology. I see that as the goal of the system. The patent system is not without its problems and embarrassments, even from this perspective of promoting innovation. Patents can sometimes get in the way of research. It's not hard to find examples of patents that have been deployed in ways that seem to slow progress and impede utilization of new technologies. But for the most part, I think the patent system has also, in the area of biomedical research, biopharmaceutical research, promoted considerable private investment in R&D, and that's what the patent system is supposed to be doing. And I think most observers would have to concede that whatever else you want to say about patents in biopharmaceutical research, this is an area where private investors pour a lot of money into R&D, and that the patent system has made them more willing to do that than they would be without patents. Moreover, I like to think that the R&D that patents promote in this area has high value. It generates new technological advances that prolong and improve people's lives. So overall, I think in this technological context, patents, I like to think, have been a good thing. So issues involving parallel trade in drugs have been problematic for me, for someone who's trying to hold on to this view of the world. For a number of reasons. And I want to focus on two issues that have received a lot of attention in the American press in recent years and that provide, I think, an interesting juxtaposition that deal with similar issues but have been framed quite differently. First is the problem of access to essential medicines in developing countries. Here, the focus of debate has been largely about the terms of patent law that are permissible under the TRIPS agreements and how far patent rights constrain the ability of developing nations to secure cheap versions of drugs to meet public health needs and whether these constraints are necessary and justified. The second problem is the problem of reimportation of drugs into the U.S. That were sold more cheaply abroad, specifically in Canada. That's where the issue has been most salient in the U.S. In this context, the debate has been very much not about patent law. There's been very little attention paid to the terms of patent law, either U.S. patent law or foreign patent law. Instead, there's been patent protection on both sides of the border. The apparent legal obstacle to securing cheaper drugs in the U.S. has been a health and safety statute, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. Which prohibits the reimportation of drugs into the U.S. Without the consent of the manufacturer. So rather than being about patents and R&D incentives, the debate in the U.S. has been about health and safety. Now, the first problem, the problem of access to essential medicines in developing countries and in least developed countries, has been just a huge embarrassment for the patent system. It highlights the significant downside to patent protection in a technological setting where patent protection really seems to matter to innovation incentives. In no other context does the economist's phrase dead weight loss convey more aptly and more poignantly the resulting social costs that are associated with the high prices prevailing for patented products. The body count has been staggering, and at least in the media, drug patents have taken much of the blame. Conflicts over access to drugs have presented the pharmaceutical industry, this very patent-sensitive industry, as an obstacle to human health rather than as a major investor in technologies to improve human health. The positive picture of the industry is a major investor in technologies to improve human health. The pharmaceutical industry has insisted that patents are not the problem here. Patents are not what keeps drugs from reaching sick people in developing countries, pointing out that many of these countries lack essential infrastructure for providing health care and distributing drugs, and lack resources to pay even for drugs that are off patent and that are available in generic form. They cite studies indicating that most essential medicines are not patented at all in the least developed countries, even where local laws permit patenting of these drugs, because firms haven't bothered to file for patents in these countries. It's not worth it to them unless there's a substantial middle class that can pay the higher prices, or a manufacturing capability that threatens local competition, which often there is not. And so they note that unpatented essential medicines still remain generally unavailable in LDCs, and they invite the conclusion that patent protection is so far down on the list of impediments to access in these countries that it's not worth worrying about. The problem isn't patents, but rather poverty. But they themselves have basically contradicted this claim through their own behavior over and over again. And that's a serious political problem. It suggests that they don't really believe it themselves. They have invested considerable political capital in pushing for all nations to upgrade their patent laws through the TRIPS agreement as a condition for access to world markets. They pushed for further patent protection in the terms of regional and bilateral TRIPS Plus agreements. They have fought aggressively to strike down laws in developing nations that compromise their patents in order to improve access to medicines, sometimes by filing lawsuits to set aside these laws, as in South Africa and Brazil, sometimes by enlisting the U.S. Trade Representative and Congress in their cause, by imposing or threatening trade sanctions under U.S. law or the withholding of U.S. aid unless these nations toe the line with their patent laws. And all of these moves suggest that patent law in developing nations really matters, that it's doing real work, that it matters enough to be worth fighting over. And so the developing nations, paying more attention to what the industry does than to what it says, have responded by pushing their own cause in the legal arena, by seeking to modify their patent laws, by seeking to modify or clarify the TRIPS agreement, most notably through the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement and public health. So the pharmaceutical industry has put considerable energy into resisting these moves as well, to the extent of making the U.S. a conspicuous holdout against language clarifying the ability of the least developed countries to import generic versions of essential medicines from abroad for a time. So the amount of energy and political capital that went into this battle suggests that patent law really matters on both sides, that it's not just far down on the list of impediments to access. Switching to the U.S.-Canadian border, these more recent controversies over the reimportation of prescription drugs into the U.S. From Canada have highlighted the problem of parallel trade in drugs from a different angle. In this setting, the pharmaceutical industry, along with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, have generally stressed concerns about health and safety rather than economics to justify blocking parallel imports at the border. Rather than invoking patent law and saying that these imported drugs that were sold in Canada violate the U.S. patent rights of the firms, they have instead relied on drug regulation, on the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And the face of opposition to the imports has not been the drug companies themselves, but rather the FDA. The industry itself was often the face of opposition to relaxing the force of drug patents in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, it was the industry itself that, through its trade group, that filed suit against Nelson Mandela. Even at times, the industry parted company with the U.S. trade representative toward the end of the Clinton administration. They were out there on their own. But they've been spared the burden of invoking their own patent rights against drugs imported from Canada. Instead, they've been able to sit back and take advantage of FDA enforcement of the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. Now, that statute was not strictly about reimportation of drugs. As enacted by Congress, that act was aimed at controlling a number of marketing practices that had the effect of diverting drugs into secondary markets with the risk of introducing mislabeled or subpotent or adulterated or counterfeit drugs into the distribution system. In addition to prohibiting the reimportation of drugs without permission of the manufacturer, that act also had other provisions that were aimed basically at maintaining a record to permit tracking the origin of drugs as they move through commerce. Now, most of these provisions have never really been implemented. Partly as a result of pressure from industry, because the measures that they require are costly. And so the FDA has repeatedly deferred implementing most of these health and safety measures at the same time that they have assiduously enforced the prohibition on reimportation. The justification that FDA invokes, protection of the public from unsafe products, cannot be dismissed. There are real concerns here. There's a growing international market in counterfeit drugs. Even genuine drugs can become safe or ineffective if they are mishandled in storage or shipment, and drugs coming from abroad, it's harder to tell how they've been handled. But of course, these risks do also apply to domestic products as well as to imports. The health and safety justification for blocking imports of drugs from lower priced markets rings somewhat hollow against the casual timeline in implementing these other provisions of the Act that are more squarely addressed to safety concerns arising in the channels of distribution, whether in the U.S. or abroad. And of course, it has not escaped the notice of the American public that FDA enforcement of the ban on reimportation has a significant economic side effect of restricting access to cheaper drugs from across the border. Since the American public doesn't really believe that drugs reimported from Canada are unsafe, they tend to suspect that this economic side effect is actually driving the anti-reimportation policy of the administration. And in fact, outgoing FDA Commissioner Mark McClellan acknowledged as much. He admitted to a concern over the disparity in the prices of drugs in the U.S. and Canada in a recent interview published in Health Affairs. He saw this as unfair, but the fairness issue that seemed to worry him in that interview was not that Americans are paying too much for patent-protected drugs, but rather that it's unfair that Canadians are paying so little, that Americans are therefore unfairly shouldering the burden of promoting R&D. I want to quote at some length from this despite my limited time because it's kind of interesting here. He says, "Americans should be angry. It's not fair that we're paying so much more for drugs that should be available across the world and that all developed nations of the world need to share in making available around the world. I don't think the current situation is sustainable. Something's going to give. The question is whether prices in the United States are going to come down and whether our focus is going to increasingly be on just paying the cost of a few additional pills as it is in much of the rest of the world, in which case we're not going to get the same kind of information as I'd like to hope for. And the big losers there are patients with diseases that are currently not treatable around the world, diseases where the potential exists, where more R&D is going on than ever before, but we aren't yet seeing the products ready for patients. And that's why I think that we have to find a better global solution to this problem, one with fairer pricing around the world." 4 to 5 minutes, no problem. So in other words, if the U.S. follows the rest of the world and pays no more than the cost of a few additional pills, we're not going to see as much innovation as McClellan wants. So presumably when he calls for fairer pricing around the world, what he has in mind is not that our prices are going to drop to match those of other countries, but that other countries will follow our lead to provide more support for innovation. Now, this was a rare moment of candor. If the position of FDA is in fact motivated by concern over the impact of parallel trade on R&D incentives, that's not usually what they say. Instead, they consistently invoke the justification of safety. This strategy has been successful in the courts. For example, in the case of U.S. versus RX Depot, which shut down a commercial reimporter of drugs from Canada. It's been somewhat less successful before Congress, which has repeatedly tried to change the law to permit reimportation of drugs from Canada. But each time Congress has acted, it has made the effectiveness of the legislation contingent upon a determination by the Secretary of Health and Human Services that the change in the law will pose no new risk to health and safety for American consumers. And so far, the secretaries of HHS have not done that. Secretary Donna Shalala declined to make such a determination at the end of the Clinton administration, and current Secretary Tommy Thompson has so far not made the necessary findings, and I suspect is unlikely to do so. So at least for the time being, the pharmaceutical industry, I think, can count on the U.S. government to serve as their border patrol, protecting the higher prices that they charge for drugs in the U.S. against price-lowering parallel imports. Now, in both of these settings, one gets the feeling that the legal arguments are inauthentic or at least beside the point. They're focusing on issues that don't really go to the heart of the matter. From an economic perspective, it's hard to fathom the energy that the pharmaceutical industry has put into fortifying patent laws in developing nations, given how little money they stand to make in these markets with or without patent protection. Even in countries like South Africa that have some middle-class consumers who could buy expensive patented drugs, the contribution that these consumers could make to the worldwide pharmaceutical rent streams has got to be trivial, and the competing public health interest is enormous. Where we talk about the public health interest is in the U.S., and there the public health interest seems pretty plus minus. It's hard to fathom the energy from a public health perspective, the energy that the U.S. government has put into blocking the reimportation of drugs from Canada. Perhaps some portion of these drugs are counterfeits, but that's not what's really at stake here. The real issue is prices and the indignation of American consumers who find themselves on the losing ends of international price discrimination in the market for drugs. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't want to talk about the benefits of price discrimination in this context, in this current political environment. The conflict over access to drugs in South Africa, that was the time to talk about price discrimination. That was the context in which price discrimination would have looked really good. At the U.S.-Canadian border, it looks really bad. But I think the pharmaceutical industry really botched an opportunity to embrace price discrimination in sub-Saharan Africa as a way of improving access to essential medicines that furthers humanitarian goals while protecting R&D incentives. Now it finds itself struggling to protect price discrimination in a context where it's a lot harder to defend. From an economic perspective, price discrimination looks like a great solution in South Africa, right? If folks in sub-Saharan Africa can't pay as much as folks in the U.S. For medicines, but can still come up with maybe enough money to cover the marginal cost of supplying the product to them, then you might expect the patent holders, the developers of patent-protected products, to sell them at different prices in the U.S. Than in sub-Saharan Africa. This happens in lots of other settings where sellers are able to draw a line between those who can or are willing to pay more and those who can't. Cheaper student ticket prices, early bird specials in restaurants for seniors, night and weekend minutes on calling plans. None of these examples provoked much indignation among consumers. But in the U.S. today, the price discrimination looks really bad to American consumers. Instead of providing cheaper prices to people of more limited means, price discrimination in the market for drugs more often works to keep drugs out of reach of the uninsured. So it looks terrible, it looks arbitrary, and it's a hard sell at this point in time, particularly when you're looking at U.S. versus Canada. So I'm out of time. I have a lot more to say, but I think in the interest of keeping us on schedule, I should probably just stop abruptly and hope that some of the many people out in the audience who know more about this issue than I do will feel free to catch up with me later and tell me what I need to know. Thank you.